As the first 100 days of Donald Trump's second term have come and gone, I've been thinking about how his presidency is being described, how it should be described, what it means for America and the world, and what the opposition is, right now, to Donald Trump. In particular, I've been struck by these huge rallies, as is my colleague Danny Postel, who will join me later. But these rallies that Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have led under the title Fighting Oligarchy. They've drawn hundreds of thousands across the United States and have clearly struck a chord with a large part of the American public. And it got me thinking about the terms used to describe the current moment, such as oligarchy, which takes center stage in the Sanders and AOC campaign. Is it a useful term? A politically expedient term? Is it a term that enough people can understand? Danny, I know, is persuaded that it is. And we got on to talking about some of the other umbrella terms like fascism that have gradually come to dominate the public discourse around the Trump administration in a way that I'm not sure is actually constructive. Danny and I had a lively discussion on those issues, which you'll hear later in the episode. But first, Danny spoke to Sarah Chayes, a former reporter with NPR, a former special advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as a former senior associate in the Democracy and Rule of Law program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's written multiple books on state-level corruption and oligarchies, including On Corruption in America. First, here's Danny's interview with Sarah.
Well, Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
It's a great pleasure.
So you've written two books on corruption, Thieves of State, and a second volume that looks at corruption in America. And I really love the title of the British edition of that book, Everybody Knows, for its evocation of the Leonard Cohen song. Is that actually why you titled it that way?
That is exactly why I titled it that way, and I begged Knopf, the U.S. publisher, to accept that title, and they wouldn't, and I think the Brits had it, and the cover's gorgeous.
So you've written two books on corruption, and the second one on the U.S. came out in 2020, so at the end of the first Trump presidency. And in the book, you wrote the following: Trump is at once a symptom, a kind of apotheosis of America's increasingly corrupt system, and an exaggeration of it, so extreme as to seem like a grotesque aberration, like reality distorted by one of those curved funhouse mirrors. His bald use of his office to patronize and promote his businesses, including raking in kick-ups from lower echelons, such as military contingents and subordinates who take detours to stay in his hotels, outstrips anything I have witnessed in a developing country, as does his penchant for surrounding himself with men entwined with foreign criminal networks. Now, as I say, that book came out at the end of the first Trump administration in 2020. How do you compare the first and second Trump presidencies? Of course, we've only got a little bit more than 100 days of the second one. But do you see Trump 2.0 as more of the same on this score, or do you see any new features to it?
It feels even more unleashed than it was then. It's almost as though that was the trial run. And given that, number one, nothing really succeeded in breaking him, in holding him back, that none of even the legal cases that were brought against him really didn't touch on this issue in particular. And given that he won what appears to be quite a convincing victory in 2024, it's like, okay, you knew what you were getting. And so I would say it's even more unleashed in two regards. One is the amassing of his personal fortune. So now we've got the members of his family who, to some extent, had a role in government as well as a role in business. Now they're just out, with the cash registers, with the toll booths, running around the world, collecting on the transactional use of power. Secondly, you have the whole crypto side of things, and that's new. That didn't exist in the first Trump administration, and that is a completely opaque way in which those seeking to curry his favor or seeking to enter his network can just, I almost want to say, unload the dump trucks, you know what I mean, of money. And it's, again, ironically, On Corruption in America, I have a somewhat philosophical early chapter about money, in which I allude to the mythological king Midas. And the story of Midas is a story of gold, physically. What's really interesting is people, including Trump himself, has referred to himself as someone with the Midas touch. And if you ask almost any Westerner, is the Midas touch a good thing or a bad thing? They'll say, oh, that's wonderful. It means everything you touch, you earn money from it. It works out well. In fact, the myth means the opposite. The myth is about how fatal to the individual and to society the Midas touch is. But it's about gold. And what's fascinating is today, money is not even an object, a physical object anymore. It's so invisible, it's just electronic signals. And so this race for ever more gold, as it were, is really a race with no finish line for zeros in bank accounts. And so the idea that Donald Trump this time around notices that and, goes straight for the both cryptocurrency, which is both outside the money printing or minting prerogative of a sovereign, it's opaque and it's utterly invisible, just shows sort of how up with the times he is. And the other thing I really noticed early on is the very first target within the federal government was the electronic payment system. And if you look at who were members of Trump's first kind of networks and who they are today, a really new element today is the whole PayPal mafia. And this tech side of things, I think quite brilliantly, Trump has seen that that is how to amass wealth in a completely unsupervisable way.
Yeah, and I want to get into some of that with you. But let's back up a little bit to the very beginnings of Trump's presidential juggernaut in 2015 when he first announced that he was running for president. One of the defining slogans of that 2016 campaign was "Drain the Swamp," as I'm sure you recall. So I have two questions for you about this. The first one is, how do you make sense of this phrase, "drain the swamp," and its kind of powerful resonance with Trump supporters? And then secondly, how do we square this apparent desire to drain the swamp with the fact that Trump himself, as you argue, has overseen corruption on an unprecedented scale?
The first answer I would give you to that is Trump didn't invent corruption. The U.S. system, and On Corruption in America, or everybody knows, tracks a kind of veering since about 1980 back toward a kind of kleptocratic system such as existed, I want to say, in the Gilded Age, with all of the same implications. And that was true under leaderships of both parties. Now, I know there's a lot of talk about whataboutism and about false equivalency and things like that. I'm not trying to say they're identical. However, I think it's wrong just to say that because the Trump administration is more egregious, then we get to sort of turn a blind eye to practices that were entrenched under Democratic administrations. For example, the book tracks a series of Supreme Court cases, and what really shocked me that had the effect of essentially legalizing what ordinary people consider to be corruption. And what shocked me was how many of these decisions were unanimous ones. So while we have had a tendency to talk about the Supreme Court as being highly polarized and, liberal justices and conservative justices, that may be true on social issues, but it has not been true when it came to matters of government integrity. And so the fact is that corruption was already a very significant problem in the American governing system, and Americans of all political affiliations were experiencing it. And that is part of why, in my view, half of them don't vote, because they just don't see enough of a distinction between the two major political parties. And that's partly due to the role of money in the U.S. electoral system. And I think it's also due to a kind of willingness to turn a blind eye to self-serving, both during, not so much, I want to say, while an individual holds office, but very frequently afterwards. So you have what is called here the revolving door, where people move between businesses or industries and government agencies that regulate or contract with those businesses and industries. And it's called the revolving door, which I don't actually think is a very accurate way of putting it, because that implies that it's one individual on his or her own volition who's doing that revolving. But to me, that's exactly how these networks of corruption weave themselves. They're constantly shifting their personnel from one element of, either private or public sector function or occasionally criminal function to another. And that's how they weave their fabric. And so I think the answer to the first part of your question is that slogan, "Drain the Swamp," was super popular because people know that our politics are corrupt, people on the left and on the right. Because don't forget that during that same campaign, Bernie Sanders, who has a completely different political outlook and vision and objective than Trump does, he was really focusing on the very same issue. And where Trump may have just used it because it was popular, because it worked, Bernie really cared and still cares about it. And so I think it was the most significant issue in the election of 2016. Now, your next question was, okay, but then why did people pick a super corrupt person? And what I would say, I think there are two answers to that. One is, and this is an answer that was covered in my prior book, Thieves of State, which really shows how when people despair of having any recourse or any way of airing and addressing their legitimate grievances within the civic system, they go to extremes. And ironically, those extremes are often extremist, ideologically, even religiously, and often it's just they want a wrecking ball. And I think Donald Trump captured that degree of indignation really successfully, and kind of led with the idea, and is still leading with the idea, that I'm going to tear this thing down, this thing that you hate. And people get carried away. And I also think it's very cynical on his part, but I think that he is playing to certain cultural tropes and certain ways of self-identification and, I want to say, almost cultural pride that a lot of his base has, that the opposition to Trump whose importance the opposition to Trump has completely neglected. And so the type of language that mainstream Democrats tend to use when they talk about rural people, I mean, you couldn't get away with using that kind of language with respect to Black people or Jews, or, you know what I mean? There is a patent disdain for people who do not live in cities that is insulting. And I think they've reaped a little bit of what they've sowed. There's a really brilliant thinker on a lot of these issues named Masha Gessen. And they are born in Russia and have that kind of perspective on events as they're unfolding in the United States. And one point Masha Gessen makes is that the idea that Trump voters are voting in spite of their economic interests is not quite accurate. It's that the indignation that those voters feel and the sense of personal humiliation that they feel is so strong and so vibrant that they're actually willing to subordinate their economic interests to that. And I think that's a super important point that a lot of folks on the left have not really taken to heart.
So speaking of that indignation that you just mentioned, Sarah, we've seen a rolling wave of protests across the U.S. in recent weeks, from the hands-off protests on April 5th, the No Kings on April 19th. There were a series of protests across the country on May 1st. You've had these town halls challenging Republican members of Congress over the Doge cuts. You have Bernie Sanders, who you mentioned a little bit earlier, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who've been doing this fighting oligarchy tour. They've got 250,000 people who have turned out, including in some very red states and red areas of blue states. So I guess what I want to ask you is, what do you make of this wave of discontent?
If there is something else that is new about this second term of Trump's, it is the ferocity and the swiftness with which the government is being dismantled. And Musk has been at the forefront of that. What's so fascinating to me is that I came into this whole issue looking at developing countries. And in that kind of world, there's a lot of talk in the West about, quote, failed and failing states. And the trope was that corruption kind of creeps in to a state that is otherwise failed or failing. And the argument that I tried to make for years is that they're not just failed or failing, they are being made to fail, that the cause and the effect are different, that these are kleptocratic states that are being deliberately sabotaged by the kleptocratic networks that control them. And so, I mean, everybody knows On Corruption in America took a dispassionate look at the United States from that perspective and looked at how the instruments of state function in the United States had been systematically either captured or hollowed out. But wow, I mean, that first 100 days of Trump 2, led by Musk, was, I mean, off the charts. As I said before, starting from let's put a bunch of 20-year-olds in charge of the federal government's electronic payment system? Are you kidding me? And then just a wholesale dismantling of government departments. We mentioned a little bit earlier Masha or M. Gessen, who has said that the trajectory under Trump 2 in the United States has been faster than in comparable countries like Hungary, like Putin's Russia. I mean, this has been just calamitous. And again, the kind of point man on it was someone almost guaranteed to draw the concern, if not the ire, of the American population. That being said, yes, I love it. I personally love it that finally there's a little bit of pushback coming from the population. That being said, you know, I took a close look at the situation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I would say the level, the sophistication, the perseverance, and the courage and the creativity of the opposition movements during that period just beats us hands down.
What do you make of the sudden ubiquity of the term oligarchy in the national conversation? It seems to me that it's gotten the most traction when people target specific oligarchs like Musk. It seems to me that there's a kind of parallel there between your argument and the way Bernie Sanders is emphasizing the oligarchy, which there has been some pushback against, and we can get into that. But I'm just wondering what you think of this sudden vocabulary shift.
I find it very interesting. I find it very useful. I think that So the term that I tend to use is kleptocratic networks. And, I've talked about network analysis. What we have is the Russian example. And I think there's a ring to it. And I think there is a fairly recent, palpable example of it that people can relate to. And so I think those are two reasons why it's come forward. And what's interesting is the number of and I have to say, I've been in some conversations with Bernie Sanders, and I think he gets this really well. The man is brilliant in a sophisticated way that he doesn't always share when he's on the stump, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so what I've noticed among some of the colleagues who have been in the room with him is a lot of them have cut their teeth on studies of Russia or Eastern Europe, where oligarchy is a way that this has been configured over the last number of decades. And so I think those factors contribute to the word arising. Like I said, kleptocratic network never had a chance. I would just make the following distinction, which I think anyone who is a Russia-Eurasia specialist would make. There was a period of oligarchy in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union and before the rise of Putin, which is when those networks of semi-autonomous and competitive, but also sort of equivalent local potentates, not potentates, but local actors,
Power brokers.
Power brokers, thank you very much. When they were really in the lead, and there have been countries where I've seen that be the case, then Putin came along and he subordinated them. So Russia is no longer an oligarchy, and I would say that the U.S. isn't either, because as strong as Bezos and Musk and all of those guys may be, they have bent the knee to Trump. Trump runs it. And so that's the only caveat that I would put on the use of that word.
It is interesting to see how the term has come into use in American political vocabulary over the last 100 days, especially. I mean, it existed before that, but it's just spiked. And then, of course, the offshoot broligarchy, which is a little cutesy, but it does speak to something, doesn't it?
I think so. And I kind of agree with that's what I said. It still has 4 syllables, right? That's why I avoided it, but I never came up with anything better. There's another figure that I'd love you to put into this conversation who isn't using exactly the same terminology or doesn't quite have the same framing, but I think is absolutely on the right track, who is Chris Murphy, a senator from Connecticut. And he's talking about a lot of these things, and he's also making a little bit more of a point about how the emphasis on identity groupings, which has been very much a part of the Democratic Party and progressive, again, lexicon over the last 4 or 5 years, the ways in which that can be counterproductive. And I've noticed it a lot just in my own professional life where, I've been on the board of a nonprofit, for example, that got all interested in diversity, naturally, immediately in the wake of the George Floyd murder. And so then it became a big issue about how the board was going to be diversified, the board of directors. And there were these categories, color, gender, political affiliation, geography. I put my hand up and I said, class. After the conversation, there was like a resume of the conversation: color, gender, political affiliation, geography.
Class didn't make the cut.
Didn't make the cut.
I mean, isn't that reflective of the fact that, frankly, it's these organizations, and I've worked for nonprofits as well and social justice groups, they just tend to draw people with college-educated backgrounds, middle or upper middle class, and that's not a criticism. It's just a sociological reality. There's not a lot of working class.
But it is a criticism. I want to say it is a criticism because, again, a lot of people have been talking about how the Democratic Party lost the working class, and it did. And the fact is, if you consider that the greatest threat, certainly to democracy, I want to say to the United States as we know it, is the super rich class, is the billionaires. They've got the resources. The other side, all we have is the numbers. So once you start splitting us up into culture groups, then you're just making the bed. You're just, paving the road for the billionaires to laugh all the way to the bank, which unfortunately I think is what's happened.
Sarah Chayes, thank you so much for joining us on The Lead.
It's been a great pleasure, Danny.
That was Sarah Chayes joining Danny from West Virginia. You two, I think, bonded over this word oligarchy, which, the two of you discussed it in some detail. And I think it's perhaps a good way to start, because I think you and I have a disagreement about this, which seems to tally with the disagreement that some Democrats have about the term. The exchange, the background to it, you already know, the background to it is this exchange between a journalist and the Democratic Senator Elisa Slotkin, who criticized Bernie Sanders because of the use of the word oligarchy. And she was saying that she doesn't disagree with the concepts of the principles, but when you have to communicate to quite a lot of people, they may not know what an oligarchy is.
Including her own father.
Well, that was famously the point, right? That she said her father had asked her what an oligarchy is. I suppose we should start with Bernie Sanders, AOC, enormous crowds. They clearly get what the logic of the oligarchy label is. So why am I so against it?
Well, I suspect, Faisal, that you're skeptical about this term in just the way that Elisa Slotkin is skeptical about it, that it just doesn't, it sounds clunky. It's not the kind of term that people use in everyday life. Ordinary people don't speak that way. And so, the Democrats in general have had this kind of monkey on their back for some decades now, even before the rise of Donald Trump, which is that they're seen as, rightly or wrongly, they're seen as a party of elites, of the college-educated, of coastal elites and liberals who sneer at ordinary working-class people who speak a different language, who speak in a code of academies or social justice, a social justice lexicon that just doesn't resonate with ordinary people. And so I think what Elisa Slotkin was suggesting there is that precisely, not only is this specific term, oligarchy, perhaps a bit clunky for rallying the troops politically, but more generally, maybe she's looking to develop, to generate more energy in the party, which she calls alpha energy. She and many other Democrats are saying, we need to reach working class voters that the Democrats are losing. We need to excite people and speak the language of ordinary Americans, not this sort of elite academic type removed, rarefied discourse.
But I wonder if that word oligarchy has legs, political legs, whether it's the kind of word that in 18 months will still be able to hold together a political group.
It might not, and we'll have to see. I think that, to back up a little bit, the moment when you had the term oligarchy and its slightly playful offshoot broligarchy, those terms seem to really catch fire on Inauguration Day. If you remember that spectacle of Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jeff Bezos, along with the CEOs of Google and Apple, seated, more prominently than even the cabinet members, Trump's cabinet members. It just brought things into focus in this really kind of in-your-face way where people were like, well, wait a minute, these are these tech bros. Some people are talking about oligarchy. Maybe it's a broligarchy. And so these were some of the most searched terms. On the one hand, yes, it sounds clunky. It's not the kind of term you would hear in ordinary everyday life. On the other hand, it is catching fire. And Bernie Sanders and AOC are filling stadiums. They're getting 30, 35,000
No, I get it.
people.
I've seen the news reports. What I don't like about it is that I think the difficulty I have with it is that it practically invites the kind of nitpicking that the left loves. It invites people to go, is it really an oligarchy? Is it technically an oligarchy? I mean,
Right.
your colleague, Jeffrey Winters, that you've mentioned, when he's written in the past about oligarchy, he said that part of the benefit of using that term is that people know about the oligarchs in Russia. And so it is a useful way to explain to people that there's been this capture by the elites in the United States. Now, I wonder, and again, this is why I have a problem with it, because it feels as if you're inviting the nitpicking, because America is not an oligarchy in the way that 1990s Russia was. The oligarchs do not have the power that the Russian oligarchs had. As much as you talk about that, what some have called the trillionaires' row, in front of Trump, only one of those people is in government, Musk. Bezos isn't, Zuckerberg isn't, Sundar Pichai isn't.
That's true, but they play an important role. I mean, Bezos owns the Washington Post. He famously said after Trump's election that the editorial pages of the Post, they would come under a kind of ideological conformity. They would be on message promoting capitalism, free markets, free speech, liberties, whatever the exact formulation was. And, there are reports that when Amazon recently hinted that it was going to list two different prices, the actual price for an item and, the tariff price. Trump got wind of this, called Bezos, and called it off. Now, Amazon has denied that. They said it probably wasn't going to fly anyway, but Trump has taken credit for that. Trump himself believes, he believes that he can just call Bezos and get him to do what he wants.
Yeah,
so we don't know. But you're making a good point.
Yeah.
That anecdote about Jeffrey Winters' student who said in the first day of a class that he teaches on oligarchy and elites, the student said, well, we don't have oligarchs in America. In Russia, you have oligarchs, but in the U.S., we just have rich people. And the interesting thing about that, and I think Elon Musk is a fascinating embodiment of this, is that Americans don't really have hostility towards rich people in general. Quite the contrary.
Sure, yeah.
There's a lot of envy and admiration and sort of aspiration towards what rich people have. You could argue that that's a lot of the Trump phenomenon. Trump created this whole mythology and mystique about being a rich guy with a very exciting lifestyle, well before he entered politics. And that's part of, arguably part of his political success. Now, Elon Musk is interesting in this respect because he was also very popular before he entered the political fray. As, the CEO of Tesla, as this entrepreneur, this tech billionaire.
But he wasn't. But I mean, with Trump, he has used his money to portray the idea of competence. The idea being that because I am rich, I am also competent. Musk wasn't like that. I mean, Musk was famous and popular because he was, he was a tech bro. People liked the idea of him trying to go to Mars. That was really his attraction.
Yeah.
They weren't saying, oh, Elon Musk is so rich, he must be so competent, we've got to get that guy into the White House.
Well, here's my point. Being a super rich person does not make you an oligarch in and of itself. Oligarchy means rule by the few. That's the technical meaning of the term, the ancient Greek term. So it's not that, there are lots of billionaires who have zero political influence or very little political influence, no real interface with the political sphere. But the ones who enter the political fray, who get either directly by running for office, there are plenty of billionaires in power, or they get cabinet positions. Trump famously has the most billionaires in his cabinet in the history of the presidency. Or they just, like Musk did, he just became Trump's patron. He gave him the biggest donation in political history and became, in effect, what was being called a co-president. And then Trump, in turn, gave him Doge. And so there was this synergy between the two. And, that's when, I would argue, that's when Musk began to be seen in America as an oligarch rather than just a rich guy. He was meddling in politics. He was doing all sorts of destructive stuff, taking a chainsaw to the federal bureaucracy, laying waste to all sorts of government agencies and social safety nets and programs that people depend on. And he was seen as someone who was going to go even further, talking about Social Security as a Ponzi scheme. And then he tried to buy an election in Wisconsin, the Supreme Court election, which failed. And I think that's when Musk's popularity really began to diminish, was when he was seen as someone who was trying to buy political influence and power and do things that, were very much out of touch with where Americans were at. That's where they drew the lines.
Let me casually sidestep asking you whether you think America is an oligarchy. Let's sidestep that issue. And let me ask you instead if you think that label is a helpful label for people to understand modern America.
I guess the best way to answer that would be to see how it plays. Right? I don't think there's an objective answer to that question.
But it's playing, it seems to be playing well with Sanders and AOC.
Yes, and as I said in my conversation with Sarah Chayes, that may not have anything to do with the term oligarchy. In fact, it might be despite that term.
Right.
It may be because of the popularity of Bernie Sanders. He has a unique kind of charisma.
Yeah.
And
but let's just stay on the point about the oligarchy. So do you think that it is a useful lens through which to persuade the public, not to understand modern America, but to persuade the public?
I think that it has potential to clarify things. I think it has the potential to be thought-provoking and to provoke debates and discussions that were not exactly happening before. So to me, it's just interesting to see it play out. I'm not advocating for the use of the term. It might end up being too clunky and being the kind of thing exactly as Alyssa Slotkin suggests, that just doesn't fly with ordinary people. On the other hand, you remember what Bernie Sanders said when that PBS journalist asked him, to respond to Alyssa Slotkin's point. I mean, I think that's important. He said, I don't think the American people are as dumb as Senator Slotkin seems to think.
That to me is a slightly lazy response.
It was defensive.
Yeah, I mean, he knows very well that oligarchy is not an easy word to understand. But I think where the defenders of oligarchy, into which camp you are slightly dipping your toe, but into the defenders of oligarchy, I think they have I think one of the strongest things in their favor, one of the strongest lines of argument, is precisely that you've outlined, that you are showing the Americans something that perhaps had slipped under their radar, that there seemed to be an awful lot of rich people around this president, and he seems to have quite a lot of power over them, and some of them seem to be trying to exercise political power, even though they weren't voted in.
Exactly, they were unelected. And I think that highlights that we're in a special moment, whether it ends up being oligarchy or something else. The fact is, Faisal, that this Trump 2.0 moment, especially embodied in inauguration day with those guys sitting in, with pride of place, and this general situation that we're in, it has led lots of people to simply try to figure out what's going on. Can we explain this and make sense of it with existing categories, or do we need new ones? Do we need a new framework to understand what's happening in America under Trump 2.0? And whether it ends up being one of these terms or another, or we just jettison all of them and talk in more plain spoken language, the fact is something new seems to be afoot, and we're all kind of grappling with what it is. So I'm willing to cut slack. My basic orientation is to cut people slack for coming up with terms like oligarchy, patrimonialism, authoritarianism, whatever it is.
Yeah, all the catchy terms. Yeah, sure. Actually, this is a good debate. I mean, we seem to be disagreeing about everything, but this is a good debate because it is still a very live debate. I know it's something that you and I have talked about. Somebody that you've had on the podcast, Samuel Moyn, talked about it, about the difficulty of applying the fascism label to the Trump presidency.
Yeah. So let me just lay out some of the terms of that debate. On the pro side, if you will, which is to say people who argued that there is something about the fascist label that really does apply to Trump. I think the most prominent representative of that camp would have been Jason Stanley, the author of How Fascism Works, who's back in the news because he's literally expatriated himself from Trump's America and now lives in Canada. But Stanley has been hammering this fascist argument for years, since the beginning of Trumpism. You have others who say, well, it's not exactly fascism, maybe it's neo-fascism or post-fascism. The Italian historian Enzo Traverso suggests that Trumpism is akin to what he calls post-fascism. And I think their point is, no, America under Trump is not fascist. It's not a fascist state. But Trump has aspirations to be a fascist dictator. He would love to be one. He just, because of the particular constraints in America, he can't be. So all of these things are going on. Now, whether it's called oligarchy or not, maybe we just have to look past these terms. But, in the case of the fascism debate that I just laid out, they thought that even using this kind of terminology was a distraction from the more important structural issues. And Moyne even went so far as to basically troll progressives who saw Trumpism as a threat to democracy, saying that they had a pathological fixation on Trump that reflected some sort of elitist anti-populism. So this was a very heated debate, but I think to answer your question, there are two different levels here, Faisal. Academics, it is their job to study fascism, classical fascism, compare it to the present. What lessons are there from the past that apply to the current moment, etc.? What are the types, regime types, and different ideological camps? This is something that academics do for a living. But they're not suggesting that these are slogans to be adopted by, the Democratic Party or the opposition to Trump. That's a job for different people, for politicians. Now, in the current debate on oligarchy, of course, you do have actual politicians like Sanders and AOC.
Yeah, I think with fascism, the reason that I accept that there are certain aspects of the piece-by-piece dismantling of the American state, which parallel the piece-by-piece destruction of the German state in the 1930s. I accept that there are parallels that you can draw. I think the reason I'm against the fascism label is that it's really just a pejorative label. You're not, when politicians use it against Trump, they're not really trying to say, look at the dismantling of the American state. They're trying to say, this guy, bad guy. And so I'm not sure it helps a great deal. Fascism and the fight against fascism still looms large in the popular imagination in the US as it does in Europe. It's like the last pure war that the West fought. And so there's a tendency to look back at it and try to frame it in these Manichaean terms of good versus evil.
Yes, and I will say that I think that the fascism debate has more or less come to a conclusion. You don't see the term fascism being deployed nearly as frequently as it was during the first Trump administration and certainly after January 6th, 2021. That actually reinvigorated the fascism debate to an extent. I don't think that you hear the term fascism nearly as often anymore. It's that I think the ship has sailed on that, and the terms of the debate have shifted.
Let's get to the crux of the discussion, which is this a willing formula for the anti-Trump left? Because where I disagree with the Slotkin analogy that the Democrats need more alpha energy, they already have alpha energy. I mean, Bernie Sanders and AOC are really rocking the Casbah. Like, it's looking great. When you compare those rallies and the energy of those rallies to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, I mean, there's no comparison.
Right. It's still a bit early here in 2025 to know how the 2028 Democratic primary is going to shake out. Of course, there's a lot of time between now and then, but the stage is being set. And the gauntlet is being thrown down by people like AOC. There are others in the mix as well. But it's without making any predictions about 2028, Faisal, what I would say is I think there's been a palpable shift in the debate, in the national conversation. I mean, Alyssa Slotkin is a perfect example. She's saying we need more alpha energy. We need more passion. Now, what that ends up meaning, and I think that one of the most interesting points she made about that is that it's not a question of moving further to the left. Having more alpha energy doesn't necessarily mean a more progressive set of positions. He tapped into a genuinely popular thing that the Republican establishment was not reflecting, which is that there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in this country. A lot of people wanted these immigrants gone, and mainstream Republicans simply didn't go there. Trump did, and it worked. He tapped into really existing sentiment. On the tariffs, I don't think he's doing that. And I think that the inflation, the economic dislocation it's going to cause is really going to hurt people. Now, how that's going to play out politically, we just don't know. But I think we might be in a new moment here.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines Magazine. Sarah Chayes' book On Corruption in America is available now. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.